Hello, Tonya. Happy Wednesday.
How's your day going, Nathan?
It feels like it's been twice as long as it should have been. How's yours?
Yeah, the same. Today was long. I was very productive, but just I'm exhausted to be quite
Yeah,
honest.
I'm the same way. I wish I could have grabbed a nap earlier. I feel zonked.
Me too.
Well, I got good news. So I'm gonna do most of the drive-in tonight. So most of this you can just sit back and enjoy the show
Oh,
for.
nice. Okay. We're not coding tonight. I can focus on notes or be prepared.
Well, you can. I think we'll do a little bit of coding, but most of it
Okay.
will just be
Sounds good.
show and tell.
Do you play guitar or is that just for show?
I play a little bit of guitar.
Oh,
Not very well, but I play a little bit. All right. Just give some folks a little bit of time to trickle in. Yeah, like what Shaw's doing. Stretch the muscles out. Try to get out of that slump. Man. All right. So I got a question. For the folks that don't use React for their capstone, there are a couple of you that couldn't do the homework from last night because you're not using React in your capstone. For those folks, do you guys feel comfortable using Create React App yourselves? NPX Create React App. Okay. I think to just make this real easy on everybody, I think I'm going to give you liberty to use whatever React app you want, so long as it performs some kind of authentication. So if that means just creating a brand new Create React app, that will do. If you've got one from a previous example from another instructor or module, that will do. Really, all I want to see is just a GitHub link to a React app that uses authentication. Sound good? Cool. Okay. For everybody else, how has anybody dug into the homework? How are folks feeling about the concepts we talked about last night, bolting on Auth0 to our React app?
Hi, Nathan. So I had a little bit of trouble because I was trying to isolate the one page that I wanted to do the authorization.
Right.
And I was running into the problem where once it authorized me, it kept kicking me back to the home page.
Yeah.
And I put in the localhost 3000 and I thought maybe I need to do localhost 3000/form, which is the form page that I'm authorizing, but that didn't fix it either. So I'm still working through getting it to stay on that page. So I have a form page with like 4 form components that are imported. So I put the main auth tags around the form page, and then I put the more specific authorization directly on the form component that was being imported.
Mhm.
But like I said, it was kicking me back to the home page.
It's still redirecting you to the home page.
Yeah, so I just got to work on it a little bit, and I'll probably set up a time with you this weekend if that's okay to figure it out.
Yeah. I'll bet you $1 million that there is a parameter on the Auth0 provider. I'll bet you that there's a way you can say redirect when you're done here. If there's not, then I'm out $1 million, but I'll bet you the next place would be where you do the redirect with login, that call. I'll bet you there might be something you can pass into it to make sure that it redirects you back to your current URL. But yeah,
Okay.
Let's look at it.
Great, thanks.
Other questions? I will throw out one piece of advice. Take a look at it early, not because it's super complex. I feel like we walk through it in class and it's pretty plug and play, but just because Auth0 kind of throws in this extra wrinkle of there are all of the keys that you need to use on the Auth0 side and bring into your app. And if you don't get them just perfectly right, if you accidentally copy and paste the wrong thing, or you copy and paste and you miss a character, say for example, in like the client ID, the whole thing will break and you'll sit there, scratch your head and go, what did I do wrong? So try out the authentication homework as soon as you guys get the free time too. Anything else from what we covered yesterday? Any other questions or thoughts?
There's actually something I wanted to mention, Nathan, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Cool. So I'm not sure if everybody found this in the Auth0 dashboard, so I wanted to bring it up to make sure everybody knows this is a thing. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Let me show you guys. Okay, please ignore the fact that I have 50 tabs open. I'm terrible. It's a mess. The thing I want you to focus on is the universal login here. In your Auth0 dashboard, if you click on branding and then go to universal login, you can actually change the default look of the login page. So it doesn't have to have this orange star logo. You can change it to whatever logo you'd like and also adjust the colors. So you can customize it in addition to installing it into your project. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody saw that.
And Kelly, if you click on login, I believe you could
Yeah.
actually script out with HTML.
You
Yeah.
absolutely can. Yep. So over here on Customize Login page, if you click this little button to allow it access, you can come down here and customize the HTML for it. So there's actually a lot you can do with their built-in login screen. I want to make sure everybody saw that.
Thanks, Kelly.
Now you can always double back, right? Kelly, if you get it in, can you double back and just like update and change? You would just have to, yeah, okay. That's nice.
Yeah, you can change it at any time. You don't have to like do it as soon as you get it. If you want to take some time to think about it, this is always there for you.
That's awesome.
Let's see. Stop share. That's the button. I always forget.
Well, while we're sharing awesome Auth0, Auth0, I'm going to share one really quick because I was talking about that kind of head scratching moment. If you run into a situation where you just don't know why Auth0 isn't working the way that you think it should, you can go here into login and get to that same dashboard. And if you go click on monitoring and the log section right here, you can see logs about every login, and you can filter on logins that failed API operation. Nope. Let's see if I have one. There we go. So for example, when I was testing, I set up my Auth0 incorrectly, and it told me that I was failing to exchange that one-time use code for a token. It didn't show up in the network inspector. It didn't show up in my console logs on my app. The only place that I could find any information about what was going on with my authentication was here in logs. So this is another one of those handy dandy tools to have in case you run into an issue. Otherwise, you should see a bunch of green check marks and folks logging into your app correctly. But that is under monitoring logs. Any other thoughts?
I'm just curious because Brielle, I'm sorry, Nathan.
Yeah, go ahead.
So since Brielle mentioned her issue, is that something that would be helpful with that? To go in and check the log? Because she said it kept kicking her back to the main page, right? I'm just curious if it was showing unsuccessful. Or is
no, I think in Brielle's case, it's successful. It's just not taking her back to the component that she wants. She's not authenticating the whole app. She's only authenticating a small portion of it. And when it redirects, it's doing what it should be, and it's kicking back to the main page. But we need that extra. Oh, Brielle, one last thing. This would be pretty hacky, but from the front page, don't require authentication, but you could check for it. And if they are authenticated, you could send them directly to your component using the nav2 with the router. You could replace their window.location and send them directly to whatever we could get real gross with this, but I'll bet you we could find a parameter.
Yeah, no, remember us talking about the window location. Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there'll be a way to make it work eventually.
Oh, 100%. Absolutely.
Thanks.
Okay, so what I want to talk about today is I want to quickly recap the code that we wrote yesterday for Nathan's front end, Nathan's web store. Quickly recap that. We talked about a token. We talked about ID tokens. We didn't really talk about access tokens. We're going to talk about access tokens today. We're also going to talk about how to authenticate on the back end. How do we prove our identity? How do we prove the customer has logged in successfully, and then share that information with the back end? So we're going to talk about that. Then we're also going to talk about authorization. So once we know who the user is, we now have the ability to scope what they can do. So that's the authorization piece. And then I'll talk about storing passwords. Yeah, we'll talk about storing passwords. think that's it. We don't really have a whole lot to wrap up today. So we're going to probably just write a whole bunch of code. So don't feel like you have to follow along with me line for line. If you want to sit back and relax, by all means, but definitely ask questions, and I'm going to show how to do all these things. And then as far as the homework for tonight, I'd really like folks to try authorization on their capstone. So I know we talked about yesterday authenticating on the front end and knowing who our customers are. So what I'm going to show you today is a way to assign different permissions to that user once they've authenticated. And my hope is that you'll find a way to use this on your capstone. But again, all I want you to do is demonstrate you know how the authorization piece works. And if you decide you don't want to use it for the demo day, you don't want to use it for the capstone, cool. We'll just rip it out after the homework's done. So no pressure there. Are we ready to get started? I'm going to sit down with this. I can't stand it, dude. Tight. Let me share my screen. Just a quick recap from yesterday. So I'm going to go and get my front end ready. So I am in Nathan's web store today. I'm going to open up my IDE. Move that out of the way. There we go. All right. So quick recap, we talked about how to add Auth0. So up here in the highest level component of our app, we've added this Auth0 provider. I've got my credentials in here. And then we used it to wrap our app, which gives it access to the Auth0 provider context. So down in line 14 of our app, we pull out each of these different properties and functions that the Auth0 SDK provides us. And then down here, we do a check to see if the current Auth0 SDK is loading. If so, we don't want to keep loading our app. We want to let Auth0 do its thing and catch up. So that's what this is loading check is for. Is loading, again, is coming from Auth0. Okay. And then yesterday I showed how to hinge off of the authenticated. So if we go and run npm start here in web store, we kind of have two options. We can put a blanket authentication on the entirety of the app, so folks can't come to our website at all if they're not logged in. I hit log out. You'll see now all that's here is a login button. And once we hit login, continue with Google, we're now inside of the app. And the way that works is we're using the is authenticated property coming from Auth0. So we do this ternary, and that's it. We also wired up a button to do a login for us when they clicked on it. I'm actually going to back out these changes and go back to what we had earlier yesterday, where we were doing a check in line. So seeing if the user is authenticated. If they are not, we're just going to automatically send them to Auth0 to be logged in. So I'm going to get rid of some of this ternary stuff from yesterday. All right. So now this app requires the user to be authenticated before they can see anything on the screen, because we're doing this check here. If they aren't authenticated, they're going to get taken to Auth0. All right. this is where we're going to start. So what we talked about yesterday was a concept known as an ID token. So if we back up here, there's two kinds of tokens. There's an ID token and an access token that Auth0 will provide you with. The ID token is what we're going to use in the front end. And the ID token represents what hydrates that user box. We go back and look at the code here. This user variable we get from Auth0, the ID token fills out this object, this user object. So when you see this user variable coming from Auth0, think of that as holding the data in that token. All right, so the ID token represents who the user is, and it's meant for consumption by the front end. It's only ever meant to live on the front end. When I asked yesterday how we could prove to the back end who the user is, some people had thrown out there, well, let's use the ID token. And that's not a bad idea because the ID token is signed and has a cryptographic signature on it that can be verified to prove that this is the identity of a user. The ID token makes sense. But there's an additional token called an access token. That is what we will use to authenticate with the backend, or more accurately, authorize with the backend. So if we think of the ID token as being the identity of the user, the access token is really what the user is allowed to talk to. And by allowed, I mean authorized to talk to. So a user signs into our app, we get an ID token from Auth0 that contains their information, but then we also request an access token that says what the user is allowed to talk to. And the most common thing that you're going to see the user try to talk to from your website is the backend. So if you have a Node.js server, for example, like my Capstone, my Node.js server contains all of the items that are in the store. So when they log in through Auth0, they get an ID token that represents who they are, and then they also get an access token, which allows them to talk to the backend. So we've got these two tokens. And really the only thing that you have to remember is the ID token is used by the front end. The access token is used for communicating with the backend. Okay. So our strategy, we've already filled out part of this. Our strategy for proving ourselves on the front end and the back end, we've already proven who the user is on the front end. We've already gotten the ID token. But now we need to talk about how we're going to talk to our back end using the access token. So let's do that. Okay, let's go back to the code. There is a third method, or sorry, an additional method called get access token silently in the front end that Auth0 provides you with. This is what you want in order to get an access token to talk to your backend. Now, the get access token silently, it's going to return you the access token, which you can use to then make calls to the backend. But before we do that, we need to update our Auth0 app to give it instructions on what kind of access token to send our front end. So if we go back to app.js, or sorry, index.js, there's an additional parameter in here that you haven't seen called audience. And if you're only working with ID tokens, meaning that you only just need user information on the front end, you don't need to provide an audience. But since we're going to request access tokens, we need to specify an audience. And in order to get an audience, we need to do some more setup in Auth0. So I'm going to go over to Auth0. So yesterday we looked at in Auth0 how to set up applications. So like our front end single page application, this careers and code front end. We set this up yesterday in Auth0. Today what we need to set up is an API. The API is going to represent your Node.js server, whatever your backend is that you're going to request resources from. And I had the info in the slides to set this up, but you would click on Create API, and you would give it a name. So I called mine my backend. You could call yours my capstone backend. So this is going to be the Auth0 piece that goes with your Node.js backend. Okay, I've gone pretty quick. Anybody have any questions so far? Okay, so we're going to set up this API for our backend. And the identifier block here, it already has a description here. This is just an identifier to reach your backend. What you can do is you can use your Heroku app URL to your backend as the identifier here. So in my case, I have Nathan's backend, RokuApp.com. I have something like this. So I'm going to use that for my identifier. You can use whatever you want for your identifier. It doesn't even necessarily have to be a valid URL to your backend. It just needs to be a unique identifier in the shape of a URL that you can plug into your app. See, I don't even think this is a valid URL. I don't think this is my backend, but it's close enough. So I'm going to use that for my audience, for my identifier rather. And then I'll hit create and then go to the settings page. So what we're doing here is we're setting up the backend piece for Auth0. We're setting up the piece that's going to allow the front end to make calls to the backend with authentication and authorization built in. So once we have this backend set up, we're going to go back to our front end and we're going to paste in for the audience on the front end. We're going to paste in whatever that arbitrary audience we defined here into this block right here, the audience. And you'll see it says to do that as well here in Auth0. So this value is going to be used as the audience parameter on authorization calls. So now my app is set up to request a token with an audience for this backend. Okay. Our domain and our client IDs stay exactly the same. The only thing we're adding is this audience section. So once we have the audience added, once we have Auth0 requesting not only an identity, so an ID token, but now we're about to request this access token, we can go into the app.js and we can use this function, get access token silently. If we didn't have an audience, if we didn't have the API set up on Auth0, this wouldn't work. So now let's call this get access token silently. This is just like get ID token claims. It returns a promise. So we can't just say const token, or sorry, const access token equals, because that returns a promise. So this wouldn't work. So what we need to do is we need to do something similar to what we did yesterday, where we were inspecting the raw ID token. We need to add it to a use effect block and then set some kind of state in React after the promise completes. So we'll call get access token silently. Again, it's returning a promise. So we need to do something like get access token silently. What would I want to do here if I needed to access the results from this promise? Promises? Does anybody remember how to get the result from a promise? How to resolve a promise?
Isn't it that then?
Mm-hmm.
And we need, it depends on what we need, but data dot response, or I'm sorry, like it's.
No, you're absolutely right. And get access token silently, it returns one thing, and all it is the token. So it's very straightforward. The other thing we could do is we could also just say await, and we could store that back into a box. Does anybody remember the await syntax? Awaiting promises? Okay. Brandy, yes, exactly, because we have the async block up there. We can call and use the keyword await. I kind of like await a little bit, so I'm gonna, well, actually, no. No, let's make life a little bit more difficult for ourselves. Let's just use the promise. So then we get a token, and we need to store the token into some piece of React state. So I'm going to go create a box to hold on to our access token. So here I'm just creating another piece of React state to hold on to the access token. Get rid of that. Okay, and then once our promise resolves, once we have a token, let's go ahead and shove it into this access token box. Okay. All right. So we were rendering the raw ID token. I'm going to do the same thing for the access token. Let's take a look at what the access token kind of shape it is. Okay. So I'll refresh. Now, when I refreshed, you'll notice I was kicked back into the login screen. And the reason why is because the details of my login have changed. I've added an audience to my Auth0 provider here. So notice how we've added the audience here to link our API, our backend API. Now this is asking us for consent because the details of what we originally logged in with, the permissions that we gave the Auth0 provider have changed. So this is going to ask me to re-accept, and I'll just hit accept. Okay. So here's our access token. Why is the ID token not showing up? We're stringifying the ID token, and then we're setting ID token. Oh, we need to, this use effect was not firing whenever is authenticated changed. So I added the is authenticated to the dependencies for the use effect. So we should now get, there it is. So notice we've got 2 tokens now. We have 2 tokens that our app has requested. We have this ID token, we have this access token. 2 completely different tokens. And I find it really useful to go to the jwt.io website and paste in these tokens just to understand what the content is that they're giving us. I paste in the ID token. This is not the access token. This is just the ID token. And the ID token has all that data that you've seen in the user box. So this is the ID token. Again, only used by the front end, never used for authorization on the back end. Okay, so let's go and grab the access token and take a look at it. All right. So this is the access token. It's a lot smaller than the ID token because it doesn't contain as much data, and it doesn't really need to contain as much data. But I'm going to walk through the fields really quick here because the access token is pretty important. So each of these key value pairs means something within the specification of the access token. The access token conforms to a specification. And every access token is going to contain some of these fields. The first one is the issuer. So who actually issued the access token? And in this case, it's our Auth0 domain, the app that we set up on Auth0. The subject, I've never actually used this before. I know it can be modified in your app, but I've never actually used the subject. This is the audience block. So who the access token provides resources to or authorization to. So you can see that this token grants whoever is using it access to the audience that we set up for the backend. So presumably this is our Node.js backend, but also to a user info endpoint. That user info endpoint can be used to request info about the user. So whoever wields this access token, not only can they reach your backend, but they can also request details about the user. And we'll get into that here in a second. This is the timestamp for when the access token was issued. This is the timestamp for when it expires. So access tokens are only valid for a certain amount of time. And it's all configured within Auth0. In fact, if you go to the API details, there's a number here, this token expiration, and you can set that however you want. But that boils down to when you get kicked out of a website because you haven't logged into it in a while or because you left the screen or the browser for a while. That's what we're talking about here, this token expiration. For how long can you stay for how long do you have permission to access these resources? Any questions so far? There's our access token. Okay. Authorized party, never used that before. And then scope, that is the that is the underlying value for the permission defined here, read current user. So Auth0 translates that into an OpenID connect set of permissions, which is, set of scopes, which is how Google knows what to send back to Auth0. So when Auth0 acts as a authentication layer on your behalf, signing into your website, behind the scenes, we're requesting those 3 things from whoever the Google, GitHub, Facebook, Apple, whatever the party is that's providing the identity. Okay. So now that we have an access token, what do we do with it? Probably the biggest question on people's minds. Now that we have this extra token, what the heck are we going to do with it? And to talk about what we're going to do with it, we need to switch over to the back end. But before we switch over to the back end, I'm going to show you how to send the access token in your request. So notice that I have a fetch here to fetch items in my capstone. I want anybody that comes to my website to first need to log in, prove who they are, and then send an access token to get these items. Now, all of that will be done behind the scenes. The user won't have to do anything except for log in. But I want them to send an access token. I want them to prove who they are and that they have access to these resources when they fetch items from my web store. So to do that, Axios takes a headers option. Kelly, headers, module 4. Potential, yeah, some. Okay, cool. So if folks are familiar with headers, this is a way to include extra data in your HTTP requests. And I believe you guys even talked about authorization headers, right? Awesome. So we're going to use an authorization header. So headers is an object that has a key of authorization and a value of bearer. This is important because this is part of the format that the access token is expected to be sent in. Bearer, and then the access token. Okay. So now we're going to be sending that access token along with every request, specifically this one request here to the items backend. But before we actually run this code, we need to run Nathan's web store locally. So I'm going to switch this off of the Heroku app because we need to make some Node.js changes to the backend in order to accept this access token. Because right now, this Nathan's backend store, this is not accepting access tokens. So I'm going to switch this to localhost 4000, which is where I'm going to run my Node.js app here in a sec. Okay, well, this is more of a React pop quiz. Will this use effect work? Does anybody see anything wrong with this use effect? Shaw says no. I like your intuition, Shaw. You guys didn't think you'd get so much React pop quizzery in the module 11, did you? Can anybody see why this may not work? Not saying that it won't work, saying that it may not work. And I'll give a hint really quick. So we need an access token to make requests to the backend. What happens if the access token isn't set yet? So remember, access token is a piece of React state. It gets initialized with a null value or undefined. I think it's actually, I have no idea if it's null or if it's undefined. It's probably undefined. I think if we wanted to start out with null, we would need to pass in a null state to begin with. So we're running the risk of access token being null, which is not good. We don't want the user to load the page and then make a request to items and not have an access token. So how could we get it to include an access token or ensure that this is called with an access token every time? If someone knows the answer, feel free to just come on mic and let me know.
Couldn't we just write our own access token, especially since it's at localhost?
Ooh. Yes, we could. The tricky part there would be that access tokens have a signature, a cryptographic signature. So we would need to form an access token that has a valid signature, just like our ID token. You see, it's that huge blob that has a signature baked into it. It's a big immutable blob. Side tangent, yes, for unit testing or for Cypress testing, you would run into this problem because unless you force the user or force Cypress, the robot, to click through and log into your app, which is valid if you wanted to make an account just for Cypress, you would need to get into that domain of building your own access token and faking parts of it. I'm going to suggest we make another use effect block because this one starts to get a little crowded and it's kind of hard to read what all is going on in here. We have two different things happening based on whether the user is authenticated. And technically, we should really only be fetching an access token if we're authenticated. So I just spotted another bug here. So only if we're authenticated do we want to try to find an ID token and request an access token. But I think this block is starting to get overloaded. So let's take out the call to the backend to fetch the items, and let's write another use effect. And we can drop the async up here because we're no longer using the await keyword. We're just dealing with plain Jane promises. So we can simplify that a little bit. But because we're using the Axios call and we're awaiting data, we'll still need this. Okay. So there's the problem of whether the access token is defined or not. Now, how would we set up this use effect to only fire, or sorry, set this code up to only fire when access token is defined? Use a conditional statement, right? So if we have an access token, so it's truthy, it's not null, it's not undefined, that's when we want to fire this call. Now we're missing one piece, and I got my cursor real close to it. Does anybody know what we're missing here at the end of this use effect statement? What do we pass use effect as means for triggering? Yep, braces. What do the braces do? They take in a list of things that you want to watch and fire this use effect code on. So we want to watch the access token when it changes, because it's going to go from undefined to a string that contains the access token. Okay, cool. So now if we save, go back to our React app, refresh. Cool. Our cart is empty. That's because I'm not running the backend right now. There's nothing on localhost 4000, but we can go into the network. And refresh. And we can see there's a get here to localhost 4000/items. And then inside of the authorization header, we are passing that whole JWT, that JSON web token, that access token, which is good. So we're making a call to the backend, and we are including proof that we have authorization to access that server. Okay. Questions? I still haven't really explained what the access token is for. All we've done is we've gotten it on the front end, we've stuck it in a header, and we're using it to make requests to our back end. I haven't shown you what good that does on the back end, and we'll go into that next. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and I'll go ahead and get my back end all set up, and we'll meet back at 6:30. 10 minutes.
Hey, since we have a minute, do you mind if I ask you a question that's unrelated to today's topic?
Sure.
Cool. So I've only ever used VS Code. I've never used WebStorm. Would you recommend it?
Um, so I have a love-hate relationship with it, and I
Okay.
hate IDEs that take a long time, and this is the worst by far. But here's the thing: how many times does your autocomplete break? How many times does it get the wrong dependencies that you have installed? That's the only redeeming quality. Every time, it's rock solid. Rock solid. Like, you don't lose like an hour in the morning trying to like, nothing's working and I don't know how to. Also, the click in is fantastic. So let me. Okay, the click in just worked. The click in never breaks. How many times has VS Code broken for you?
Enough that I'm asking you how you feel about this, because I'm thinking about testing out something different.
Yeah, so I would definitely say WebStorm, and it's only because I have so many times that's broken. I've just been like, fine, I don't need it. I'll just memorize stuff, and then it's no, no. Yeah, so clicking always works. Autocomplete almost always works. I don't even have to think about imports anymore because I can do.
Really?
Well, no, I never have. Oh, let me show you. Like, let's get rid of Sentry and tracing.
All right.
I have no idea how to import Sentry or tracing. So I go down to here, Command Option. It gives me N number of different ways and it will automatically do it.
Okay, all right, I like that. That's good.
And the themes aren't too bad, but it is slow to start up. That's the only thing. You pay for that indexing and whatnot, but if you, I don't know. Yeah, it's a personal preference, but.
Sure. And I do like my custom themes on VS Code.
Yeah, that's one thing that like really stinks about this because let's see what we have. So there are plugins, just like any other ID, but there's one called Material Theme that gives you what kind of looks like a modern text editor, but then you've got Darkula.
Darkula. All right.
It's your granddad's text editor.
For real, dude. Like, jeez. Okay.
I mean, they don't look too bad, but no, I can't even remember what I had. I think it was Moonlight. Yeah, that's it. Cool. Oh, no, now it's off. I don't know.
Oh, no. Have you ever used PyCharm?
Oh, every day.
Okay.
Yeah, so if that's one of the nice things is if you buy into all the IntelliJ or IDEA stuff, yeah, it all works. Like I pay, I think $100 a year and I get access to every IDE. Have you seen DataGrip before?
No, I haven't.
So Beekeeper ain't got nothing on DataGrip. DataGrip is like their version of Beekeeper, and it is awesome. So like, let's see, over here on the left, you have like your whole database visualizer. And then you can run and execute queries and it will do autocomplete on your queries based on where you are.
Dude, come on.
Yeah, it will look at your schemas. So select all from metrics dots. I think it's because I haven't used DataGrip on my computer in a while, but it will do, and it will do auto formatting. So if you do like select all from blah left join a on a.id equals blah.id, and you hit Command L, SQL formatting.
That's pretty nice. I'm not mad about that.
And that's SQL formatting in here. So if you have a favorite linter, like Prettier you use in JS or something, you hit Command L, it'll automatically run it.
Oh, all right. I'm gonna have to check into that later. It looks really nice.
Yeah, you should check it out.
definitely. Also, just a quick note, it's 6:33, so we should actually like be back from class. So I just got distracted by IDs.
Use my IntelliJ code, Nathan Evans, to get 50% off your order.
All right, yes, affiliate time. We love that.
Yeah. All right, so where we just left off is we finished the front end. We finished sending the access token in our request. Okay, this is driving me nuts. I've got to get back to whatever that last theme is. I think it was material darker. No, sorry. Okay, that's fine. All right. So we just got done setting the access token, and I said, you don't really know what the access token is doing. We've looked at it in jot.io. We've seen what the contents of the access token are, but we haven't really talked about what it's going to do for us. So let me show you what it will do for us. We need to switch over to the backend. I have my backend pulled up. So I'll switch off of the web store to the backend store. Okay. So to use Auth0 with our backend, we need a library. So let's go back to the slides. All right. Oops. So here are the libraries you need to install in Node.js. So there's an Express Jot to use with our Express server. JSON Web Keys RSA, and I don't Express Jot Auth0. I don't know what that is, but we need all of these. So I'm going to take that, go to my backend, and run the npm install. Now notice it's complaining that I'm using node 14 instead of what the package requires, which is somewhere around, oh, sorry, no, I'm backwards. The package requires, let me see. Let's go look at our package.json. Yep, so I'm specifying an engine of 14.x. I'm going to update that to 16.x. And run that install again. There we go. No more errors. So now when my backend is deployed to Heroku, instead of running it with the node 14 runtime, it's just going to run it with the 16, which is fine. Okay, so we have those packages installed, and we can see them here inside of our package.json. Okay. So integration in the backend with Auth0 is pretty straightforward. So going back to the slides, there are two pieces of middleware that we want to grab, and they're on the slides. One to check permissions and one to check the jot. We're going to start with checking the jot first. So what we need to fill out is our Auth0 domain. So we need to tell the backend what Auth0 domain we're using. So if we go back to Auth0, we look under applications. We can either go here and snag this domain from our front end. We go into settings, or you can also go to settings and click on custom domains, and it will give you the name of your domain right there as well. Either way will work. You can also take it from the URL. We just need whatever the domain is that issued this access token. Okay, so we'll go and plug that in. All right. And then for the audience, we need to set this to what the audience is in our API. So this is what's going to tie the API we created in Auth0 with our Node.js server. We'll go back to Auth0, click on APIs. And I think I'm going to take this one. well, let me check first. So the audience that we're using in the front end, these two should match. So let's go back to our front end, look at index.js. So this is the audience we should use. So I'm going to grab that. Go back here. So the audience between the front end and the back end should be the same. Okay. That's it for the Auth0 piece. So if we run the back end right now, so my back end takes in a lot of different environment variables. We blow this up. So my back end takes in a port 4000, a database user, a database name, database host, takes in all of those things and uses them in order to connect to the database. So that's why I have all of this extra data, all these environment variables defined before I run my node server. If I go ahead and hit enter, oh, John is not defined. Yes, we need to import some libraries. So we need to import the libraries that we installed. So I just imported the JWT library. I'm going to also import the JWKS RSA library. I think that should be it. There we go. Yep, now we're running. So we just needed these two imports for the libraries that we installed. Okay. So now that my server is running, recall that if we make a curl to it on whatever port it's running on, in this case, I'm running on port 4000. If we make a call through the /items, it returns some items. That's what it's done since you guys have seen this. But now let's make it require authentication and authorization in order to talk to this. And the way that you would do that is check JWT, check JSON web token, which is the shape of the access token that's being sent. This object represents middleware in Express. So what we can do is we can go down to whatever endpoint we want to protect. So let's go down to here on the items endpoint. And we can pass it the check JWT middleware. Okay. So now I'll start my server again. I'll make the same curl. We get an error. And we're getting an error now because curl is not passing in an access token. But we go to our front end. So I'm going to run npm start on my front end again. We have shoes in the front end. We have shoes. And the reason why, we'll refresh again and show the network request. The reason why is because we're making a call to 4000/items, and we're including this authorization token. So check jot is looking at the access token that the front end is providing, and it's verifying that it's valid, that it has the correct audience, and that it was verified, that it was accredited, that it was issued by someone that can be proven. So Auth0 in this case. Okay, any questions? Straightforward? And again, I'll show here on the front end, if we were to do something like, let's do something that you shouldn't do, because I've mentioned that ID tokens are only used in the front end. Let's do something like send our ID token instead of our access token. Our cart is not hydrating, and the reason why is because the ID token is not valid. So we're getting a 401 coming back from our Node.js server. So that is how you would use the access token. You use the access token to talk to the backend. You would never use the ID token. Okay. Nobody has any questions about this? Just this makes sense to everyone, and access tokens are pretty straightforward. What would happen if we passed an expired access token? So if we go back to the jwt.io, recall that there's an expiration date here. What if we had sent an expired access token to our Node.js server? Exactly. It wouldn't be valid. These tokens are only good for a certain amount of time.
How do you read that expiration date? Or is that a key for something else?
Good question. It is a epoch time. So I think it's the number of seconds since epoch. So my token is valid until tomorrow at 10 p.m. or no, tomorrow at 4 my time. So it issued me a token that was valid for 24 hours. So that's the second since, what is it, 1977? What was the epoch? No, 1970. So the epoch started on January 1st, 1970. Have you guys talked about the epoch? I'm just throwing around terms. Okay. The epoch is a date from whence all timestamps are derived. So starting, you can think of the epoch 0 starting on January 1st, 1970. So starting from 0, every second since January 1st, 1970, if you added up all of those seconds, that would equal the number that you see right here. So the epoch is just a way for us as programmers to pass around values that fit nicely into an integer, as opposed to the vague date time formats, month, day, day. This is kind of more of a precise way of doing that. Although notice that this doesn't include a time zone. So this is only really useful for when you're talking about a timestamp with respect to a certain time zone. So usually UTC. That is what these two are measured in. So the issued at would also be a value coming from that. All right. So hopefully I've given you some insight into how to protect your endpoints on your server. So if we look at the error endpoint, notice that I'm not passing in a middleware. I'm not passing in a check jot function. So this endpoint, this error endpoint that I wrote, is not going to be protected. So it's completely valid to call error without authentication, and it will still raise an error. This funky code right here isn't because the jot wasn't valid or that it didn't pass authorization, but it's just because this was what we were using for sentry testing. So we could make another app.get something else. And so long as we don't async request response, so long as we don't attach that middleware on our endpoint, it's not going to require it. Okay, so that's how you pass the access token in. What can you do with the access token from the backend, though? If we look at the contents of the token, so let's look here. So this is what this endpoint is receiving with that check jot middleware. So we've added check jot to our endpoint, It's going to prevent anybody that isn't authenticated and authorized to talk to this backend. It's going to prevent any of them from calling this endpoint, which is great. But this endpoint doesn't really know anything about the user. So let's pretend like this is, instead of the items, let's pretend like this is a post endpoint for checking out. This would be a perfect one to require authentication and authorization on, right? We want to know who the user is that's checking items out. But right now, we don't really have any info about the user. And the access token that's being passed, can anybody see an email in this access token? Does anybody see a username? Does anybody see a user ID or anything along those lines?
What's the OpenID profile email? And can't we get all that from the user info endpoint? Didn't you say we can request information from that? Okay.
Yep, exactly. Yes. Yep. There is an endpoint that you can use on the back end to request information about the user. And we talked about the ID token not being suitable for sending to the back end, and that's still totally accurate. Do not fall into the trap of sending the ID token into the back end. From the back end, we can request this endpoint right here. This audience, this extra audience, this extra user info, we can request details about the user. So we will take their access token that's being sent in here, and we will make a request to get some user info from them. Okay. So in order to get the access token from the person that's calling this endpoint, we would need to pick that up off of the request. In order to read that header, that authorization header that contains the access token. So recall in the front end, we're sending the authorization bearer equals EYJ, whatever. We need to sniff that off of this request that's coming in. Okay. So we're going to look at who's calling us, what their header, their authorization header is. Now let's just print that out for right now. I'm going to switch this back to a get items endpoint instead of doing the checkout. Okay. Then I'll restart my server, go back to the front end, and refresh. There's a chance that my request header syntax is not correct. We'll see. Ah, there it is. So does this look familiar to people? So this is the authorization header that the front end sent in. So now we know what the user's access token is. Okay, so now we can use our favorite HTTP library. We could use the built-in one for Node.js. I'm going to use the Axios. I think I have it installed. Let's check. No, I don't. All right. So I'm going to npm install save Axios. Okay. There we go. We have Axios installed. Back here. Going to import Axios. And then we're going to do a get. What was that audience? It was, so we have access to this endpoint here. So this is our Auth0 domain. So we could even shorten this up by saying it's really the Auth0 domain. We've got to put this into the ticks. Auth0 domain / user info. And when we do that, we need to pass it some options. And one of those options is some headers, and we're going to send an authorization header that contains the user's access token. and we'll shove the response into a box. I think we also need to do we need to take whatever the promise is and extract the data from it. Does this look familiar to Axios users? D.data. Okay. Then let's console.log user info. Okay, let's refresh. Oh, sorry. Need to start up the backend server. Otherwise, we can't make requests to it. Okay, so we are printing out a promise, and we're still printing out the user's authorization header. So we can get rid of that access token. Can anybody see why I got a promise and how I would fix this? So I'll just rerun this now without that additional big token. There we go. So when I call the items, so I'm just refreshing this page over here, when I call the items endpoint, console is printing out a promise pending. Can anybody see why I'm not getting
Nathan, I have two. I don't know if this will
answer
what you're saying, but I thought response had to be in here somewhere. And I don't recall seeing the D.data. It was always like something else .data. It was never just a D.
So this is the variable that's coming in, and you can call that whatever you want. You can call this data, which wouldn't be great. I think some people will call this response and then do response.data. Are you used to seeing that?
Yes, thank you.
Yep, you can call the variable being passed in here anything you want. Zoom user says we have called it response. Okay. Zoom, who is Zoom user?
Zoom user is Mel.
Oh, hey, Mel. Yeah, I mean, everybody can call it whatever they want. Do we need to have another then? I don't think so. After we do this final .then, I think we should end up with whatever the data is that's being returned. So can we all agree that this returns a promise? Axios.get returns a promise. Axios.get returns a promise. We need to await. We need to await whatever the return value of that promise is. Okay. Now we run and we refresh. Now we got some stuff. What does this look like to people? Let me blow this up. What does this look like to people? Have we seen this data before? This is the contents of the user box. Now you have it on the back end. So now I have an email. I don't have an address, so I can't ship something out to somebody, but at least I have an email. So now I can associate the order that they're checking out with. So this is how you would get data about the user on the back end. So there's kind of this dance going on between the front end and the back end. The front end requests an ID token. Then the front end uses an access token to talk to the back end. Then the back end requests its version of the ID token from the user info endpoint. Okay. And this, the only reason why we're able to get this back out, this information about the user back out, is because we're using their access token. If that access token wasn't valid, we wouldn't be able to get this data. And in fact, we wouldn't even be able to hit this line of code because our middleware is checking the access tokens coming in to ensure that they're valid. So if you want to know who your user is within the context of your backend endpoint, this is how you would do it. So we could make this look a lot cleaner. We could do something like, let's take all this code out and let's make a function called get user data. It's going to take in a request object. Okay. And the function for get user data would look something like this. Where it takes in some kind of request object. And we don't need this extra variable assignment because we're just putting it into a box, which we can just directly return. So we can chop that out. So now we have a function that, given some kind of request that contains an authorization header, we can now call within our endpoints, and we can have information about the user. So if we want to know something like the user's email, it could be that simple within our endpoint. We could also get even more fancy. We could create our own middleware and automatically have the user loaded. I do want to throw out another concept, and this is just extra. If we have looked up someone's user info, given an access token, so put yourself in the shoes of this Node.js app, put yourself in the shoes of this function right here. If we've been handed an access token and we've already fetched the user details for that access token, do we ever need to fetch it again? Given an access token that we've already looked up the user info for, so let's say that someone calls app.getItems, and then that same person calls this other endpoint something else, and it has this middleware. So let's say the user calls this endpoint first. We do a lookup to get their user data, and then they call this endpoint, and we do another lookup to get their user data. Would we need to call this function? We've already done it once with their access token. Their access token is known to be truthy. It's known to be verified. So could we do something like, let's say something like this, where we create some kind of cache. And whenever we go and look up users, we could do something like this. If cache request dot header authorization. So if we find that there is already something in the cache for that authorization header, that access token, we could return whatever is stored in that cache. Let me break this out to another variable. Access token equals whatever is stored in the authorization. So if we've got an entry in our cache for that access token, we could return whatever is in that cache at that access token. If not, we could make our call to go and get our user info, and then after we're done, we could store into our cache at that access token position, we could store their user info. Because we don't necessarily want to pay for a call, a network call, every time someone hits our endpoint to go and look up user data. It's slow. It's going to tack on hundreds of milliseconds, if not seconds of lookup time for the user. So we can use a strategy like this, where if we've already gone and fetched the user's info, we could maintain a cache in memory, just a simple JavaScript object that contains those results if we've already looked them up. Now, you don't have to do this, but this is just one of those things that will help speed up your app if you decide to use if you decide to use access tokens to look up users' info. Okay.
So Nathan, this is Latonia.
Yep.
I guess I'm a little fuzzy. So cache outlives the access token, and as long as the information is stored there, you don't really care if the token has expired or not. Is that how it works?
Ooh, good point. Very good point. So we're not checking the expiration at all within our cache. So our cache could include expired access tokens. So if you think of this cache is simply a JavaScript object that's going to hold a key and a value. The key will be the access token, the value will be whatever user we fetched their details. So it's going to be a map of access token to user. That cache could include a bunch of expired tokens, absolutely. And then you would be returning expired users from that cache. So we're not checking the expiration at all, like you pointed out. The only thing that's saving me from that problem, the only thing that's saving us from running into an issue with expired access tokens is the check.jot middleware. So check.jot is not going to let any code within this function run. So it will never reach our caching function. It will never run any of the code inside of this endpoint unless it has it's a current access token, meaning it hasn't expired. So while you're absolutely true, the cache could hold expired access tokens, we won't run into that problem because we're not allowed to come into this endpoint and store something into the cache that has already expired, that already is an expired access token. Does that make sense?
It does. I guess in my head, though, I'm saying, so technically there's still a check that's being done.
Mm-hmm.
But if the cache happens to be accessible, then it's used. As I was thinking, the cache means that there's no check being done, but there is one because the
There's
okay.
Mm-hmm. Because the middleware is your first line of defense here. The middleware is going to verify that the access token coming in is not expired. It has an audience that matches, so your front end uses the same audience as your back end uses the same audience. And also that it hasn't been tampered with because it has this cryptographic signature on it. So it's going to check to see if it's been tampered with. If those things pass, then we move on to this layer. And the only thing I was trying to show with the cache is an optimization to speed up making calls to get user data. But you bring up a really good point that this cache can include access tokens that have eventually expired. But we always have, or we should always have this middleware here, this check.jot as our first line of defense against someone sending us an expired access token. That was a really good question. Anybody else have questions about this? Okay, let's talk a little bit more about authorization. So authentication is the process of determining who the user is, that they're authentic, that they're verified. Authorization is what do they have access to, and what kind of permissions do they have? What kinds of things? So yesterday we saw in Auth0 they had things like roles and groups. Those fall under the umbrella of authorization, and I want to show really quickly how you can use some of that authorization. To get started with authorization, we need that second piece of code that I had in the slides. So if we go back to the slides, the very last thing, I took this out because we don't need it necessarily. We just can add this if we want to add this extra functionality. So there's this block of code called check permissions. And it's another piece of middleware. So if we go up here to the top and we paste that in, and we import the JWT Auth0 library. So all we have to do is paste it in. Okay. And now we have this middleware that will check individual permissions. Now let me go down here. So for Express apps, if you have lots of middleware, you can continue to keep passing them in here. So we're going to pass in, oops, I'm going to pass in that check permissions middleware. This check permissions middleware takes a list of permissions to verify the user has. So let's write some permissions. And to do that, we're going to go into Auth0 because Auth0 is going to be the source of truth for what all the different possibilities of permissions are. And we can assign permissions to users as well within Auth0. So let's go into Auth0 and we're going to go into, I believe it's APIs. Yep, it is. It is APIs. So whatever your API is, whatever your backend is, I just need to quickly make sure I'm using the same audience. So it's Nathan's dash backend was mine. So it's not the my backend, it's the my capstone backend. Okay. So if you have some permissions you want, so let's say, Kyle, for your documentary, let's say that you charge people like $10 extra for the pro features, which includes like your own voice narration that you put on top of it. So $10 a month and you get access to these additional features. So let's implement a permission that would give you those features. So you would go to your API and you would start typing out wherever the permissions are. So let's say, well, let's think of one from my backend. So I've got an items endpoint here. I'm going to make a permission called read items. And the description for it's going to be something like the user can access the web store items. Okay. Oh, it all hit add. So that's going to be one of my permissions that belongs to the app. I'm going to make another one called send errors. And this permission is going to be for users to report errors to the web store. So I'm going to just add a couple of permissions. The general format of this is verb noun. So read items, send errors, that sort of thing. But honestly, it doesn't matter what you call them. This is just kind of the format that Auth0 wants you to put them in. So you do you when it comes to naming your permissions. Okay, so we've got some permissions. Now we need to protect the endpoints and require certain permissions on them. So to do that, we would use this middleware called check permissions. Check permissions takes a list of permissions to check that the user has. So this one is going to be read items. And then down here, I'm going to include check permissions. This one is going to require users to have the send errors. Is it errors? Yeah, it's errors plural. So the send errors permission. All right, I'm going to start and stop my server. I'm going to get rid of this console log because we don't really need to see user data anymore. In fact, we don't really even need user data at all. I'll just leave it in there. Okay. So running the server, we'll go to the front end. And we will refresh. Okay, so the cart is empty. Not only is the cart empty, but I believe the network request failed. So 403 forbidden. So we've switched from a 401 unauthorized that you saw earlier when the access token was being provided. We're now into the 403 forbidden territory. And if we look at the response, it says insufficient scope. So we're missing a permission in order to access this endpoint. To assign users permissions, you would go into Auth0, you would go to user management, so looking at all the users that are signed up for this app. Oh, Kelly, you signed into my app. Thank you very much. I've got 2 users in my capstone. That's awesome. All right. So you go and find the user that you want to give permissions to. Click on permissions. You can see that I have 2 permissions set from practicing what I'm showing you. Let me remove those. Okay, now let's assign some permissions. You will select what API the permissions belong to. So I clicked on my capstone backend. It has these 2 permissions. I'm going to give myself the read items permission. So I'll click add permissions. And now if I go back here and I refresh, you'll see that I still don't have anything in my cart. And the error is still insufficient scope. There is a kind of hard to find setting that you need to turn on in Auth0. So if we go back to Auth0 and go to applications, I have so many yeah, there we go. Sorry, not applications, it's under APIs. All right, so there's 2 things you need to toggle on in your application. There's this enable RBAC and this add permissions in the access token. So this is going to take the permissions that are defined in Auth0 and it's actually going to shove them into the access token. I'll show that here in a second. So make sure that you enable both of these settings. It's also in the slides. It's just one of those weird things that you got to remember to turn on with Auth0. Then we'll make sure we hit save. Now, if we refresh, there's my cart. There's my shoes. And we'll see that the response is set. Now, if we canceled this and we required that the items endpoint also includes the send errors permission, and we hit save and we ran the node server, and we refresh, cart's gone because I don't have both of the permissions. I don't have the send error permission and I have one of the permissions, but I don't have the second permission. So you can use this check permissions middleware to assign different permissions to users and lock down what they have access to. Other places this would be useful for folks that are running an admin backend. You could give them an admin permission and then lock down specific endpoints on your backend to only admins.
Excuse me, Nathan. I think I maybe misunderstood what just happened, but did they not get any permissions because they didn't have both? They had one, not the other, so they didn't get any? Is that what just happened?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Exactly. So this check permissions, it takes in as many permissions as you want to protect the endpoint with. If they don't have all of them,
okay,
then they get a 403 forbidden.
Is there an OR function for this?
Good question. I don't know. Check permissions, check all scopes. Hey, let's try that. Turn off check all scopes and let's restart the server. Refresh. Boom, there's your OR. I think. You probably want to do a little bit more deep dive and don't take me at face value here, but I think that will do it. This fail with error, I think this will leak some information into the front end to help you debug. So if we turn this back on to true, so we require every permission, I think this will just give a message and say, yeah, see, it's printing out an object here. So there's some kind of message that it's trying to send, telling us that we aren't getting. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how to coerce that object into something readable, but if you just set that to false, it will return the 403. And the 403 makes sense. You know, you don't have access to the scope, so it's going to return forbidden. or you don't have access to all the permissions. And let me show how that changed the job really quick. So here's the access token. When we went and flipped on the enable RBAC, add permissions to access token, when we toggled that on inside of the access token, we got a permissions block. And this is going to contain all the permissions that are currently assigned to that user. Okay. Questions? Anybody thinking about ways that they could use this on their capstone to authenticate and restrict users potentially? Anybody still want to do passwords? I promise that this is much less infrastructure to maintain than having to do username and passwords, and I'll show that here in a second.
Is the username and password that you're going to show us the same that we did with Max when we set up our appliances use case?
Does it take in a username and a password?
Yeah, and we had middleware, but we actually called it middleware. It was something or other.
Oh.
I'm curious if
no, I don't think I'm going to write a middleware today. I think I'll just do like a really simple endpoint for username and password. Also, I'm not really a Node.js Express guy, so if you asked me to write a middleware, I probably couldn't. To be honest, you guys would probably have to teach me how to write a middleware.
I have another question. It's when
yes.
you do the error, to get it to show you an error, fail with error, would you be able to define your own error there, or does it have to come from the ether?
I think so.
Okay.
No, I think that's something that I messed up here in check permissions. So I think that there's more here. So if we go and look up the library .auths, yeah. So you could pass in, let's see, we'll forward errors to next instead of ending the response. Oh, so this is going to pass in an object to the next thing in the list. So something, don't quote me on this, but I'm assuming that's going to pass it forward to whatever the next thing is. So you might end up with an object here, like that represents the error if there was one, is my guess. Again, I'm not really sure. One thing, this is just a free tidbit. If you're ever curious about how to use a library and you don't want to go and look at the docs or their art documentation for that library, one of the easiest things to do is go and look at the tests and see how they're using their own program in their tests. So I'm going to go and see how they use the fail with error. So they're calling this, oh yeah, I'm absolutely right. So if you set fail with error to true, it's going to give you an error variable inside of your endpoint, as demonstrated by this test that they wrote. So let's go and put an error here, and we'll console.log that error. We'll go back up here, and we'll say fail with error true. Okay. So now fail with error, this should hydrate an error parameter to our endpoint. Now, if I run that, my user does not have the send errors permission, so this should cause the thing to fail. Console.log, yeah, so there's our object. What can we do with that? Or maybe that's the old object. Let's refresh. Let's look at their test. So they have fail with error set to true. Let's print out the error.status code. I don't think this code is even getting triggered. I don't even think the next step in the sequence is getting called. I think if I do a console log, hello, Nathan, I don't think this code is even getting triggered. Let's refresh. Yep, all it's doing is printing out some object. So my code's not getting triggered. Nothing is being passed forward. So it stops right here at this middleware and it doesn't continue on to my endpoint. So Latonia, I'm not exactly sure how to dress up that error if you wanted to. I think realistically for your capstone, a 403 is more than appropriate for if someone is missing those permissions, but that's a really good question. I'm not sure. And I think part of it probably stems from the fact that I just don't really know very much about the JAWS package. Well, with that in mind, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and then we'll talk about password hashing. We'll talk about storing passwords.
Could you share a link to the code you started with tonight before you push up the new code tonight? Because the front end I was working with yesterday didn't have a back end attached to it at all. And I'd like to kind of go back through this from where you started.
Yeah.
I think the back end should be the same, the one we cloned down to unless you made any changes to it before tonight, since the night we put it on Heroku.
Nope. So you want my back end before I made any changes?
Today? No, I think just the front end, because the back end you gave us like last week to push up to Heroku in class probably is the same as the one you started with tonight, right?
Yeah, so the one that is currently up there is wired to talk to. So today in class, I wired it to talk to a local backend.
Mm-hmm.
The one that is up there in main right now, currently on GitHub, is talking to the Heroku backend.
Right, but I mean, I could change that one line of code easily. That's not a problem. Mm-hmm. Okay, yep. But where is it? It's not in the CIC classroom.
No, it's on github.com de1ux Nathan's web-store. So this.
Okay, that was the address I needed. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And it has everything up till yesterday. So let me share my, I am sharing my screen. So check this out, Kyle. This is one of the really cool things about GitHub. If you want to go back in time, there's this button right here. You can click on that. So you'll see that this commit right here contained all the changes we did in class yesterday to make the front end authentication work. If you want to go before that, you can click on any of the commits beforehand, which will rewind time to whatever those changes are. And you can click on that link right there, and it will show you all the code at that point in time. So after class is done, I'm going to push up Auth0, the whole thing that we did today. I'm going to push that up. If you want to work from scratch, then yeah, you'll want to click on, well, don't pull, I guess, would be one way of doing it. But also you can go into GitHub and click on these links to look back at a different point in time.
I was just going to clone what's up there now during the break, and then I'll have it for later. So thanks.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. Any way you want to do it. Thanks for asking. All right. We have error handling with Node.js. So we need to define our own error handler as middleware. And apparently this is how you write a piece of middleware. Kelly, are you a Node.js person?
I am, but I'm also a like not great at coding directly on the spot kind of person.
Oh, okay.
So I was like, please don't ask me to write a middleware right now.
Does this look moderately sane? This, yes. I know that this isn't the same middleware as like a endpoint middleware,
right?
But this would be construed to be middleware, right?
Yeah, I mean that looks right to me. Look at that. That doesn't seem like super odd.
So does Node.js make a distinction between middleware versus no? Okay, it's all middleware.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this is cute.
Yeah, look at that. All right.
You guys missed out in module 4. This is what you should have done.
That's adorable. I'm so sad. I love a cute diagram, and we didn't even get to talk about this. Oh, man.
Man.
Bummer.
Controller action is a fruit squeezer? Oh, dude.
That's it. We're going back. So we're doing Md5 again. Everybody buckle up. It's amazing.
Jahil, you use NodeMon, right? Do you call it NodeDemon or do you call it NodeMon? I didn't hear you.
Oh, I call it NodeMon.
Okay.
That's what Max was calling it, so that's what
okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I also say NodeMon because I picked that up from Max, but in my head, every single time it's NodeDemon. And I feel like no one's going to know what I'm talking about if I say NodeDemon. So I got used to just saying NodeMon, and then everybody seemed to understand. But whenever I read it, it's NodeDemon.
I like NodeDemon. Makes it sounds cool. I need to install that. I've been running my Node.js server.
Oh, you should definitely get that in there. No, get NodeMon in. It really does make a difference. Also, just a quick note, we should definitely be back from break.
Okay.
Ask a quick get question to follow up on right before break. Is there a way to clone I know how to get to like the previous code in the browser as you were showing me, but is there a way to clone one of those instead of the current one?
There is most people don't clone at a version. Most of the time they clone and then they go to a version. And the way that you get to a version in Git is you say Git checkout and then you pass it whatever the SHA is, whatever that big string is. So let's take my repo, for example. If we go to Nathan's web store and we want to go back in time, let me first push that up. There we go. Okay. If we want to go back in time, let's go to the web UI and find the repo that we want to. So here's all of the history. We can grab one of these SHAs using the clipboard. And we can say git checkout and pass it the SHA. Now it's upset because you can't go back in time unless you have no changes. So if you have changes, it will stop you because it doesn't know how to take your current changes that you haven't committed and replay those back in time because things may have changed.
Well, you probably do that in a different folder though. Like, I don't know, say I really messed up my code and I wanted to go back a ways back or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Then you just use the folder and it would work fine, right?
Right. So you could say git checkout and you pass it this SHA and it will go there. Notice, I don't know if other people have this, but my branch changed. So I'm not on main anymore. I'm now detached. I'm on this SHA. So we haven't really talked about branches with Git, but anyways, this will help you. But you'll be it's kind of complicated. So to get back, you would say git checkout main. So you could get back to the branch you were on, and then just to be extra sure I'm up to date, I'm going to do a git pull origin main. Yep, I'm up to date.
Okay.
Git checkout. That's one of the things that we haven't covered because there's a whole world of Git that we haven't talked about. Social Git, where you make changes and then you make pull requests and you work with others in a social way. You know, here's my code. Tell me if I have any bugs or if it looks good to you. What do you think about this? So we've talked about Git as a way of backing up our stuff and saving our changes and tracking them on Git. But there's a world of social Git that we haven't gone into. And I don't think that's a bad thing because every company kind of does Git a little bit differently. Everybody has their different way that they like to do things. So,
I mean, it's a little bit of a bad thing though. Like this is definitely something the students are going to run into, especially like once they graduate. So just speaking personally, I kind of wish we'd done a bit more group Git when we went through my cohort because like I'm really good at doing solo Git, but that first time I went to collaborate with someone, I was like, what's happening? Where am I? How am I in a detached head? What's going on here? So that's actually something I'd like to see integrated into cohort 3 is just a section where I don't know if it's, you know, a group project or whatever it is, but I'd love to see some group Git practice.
Yeah, I agree. I think the reason why I think it's not as big of a deal to not have that social Git is because I was lucky enough to have people that just babied me when I first started programming, and they gently set me down and said, now listen here, this is how you do things. And I hope that everyone else gets that kind of mentor when they land at their job, someone to show you how to do the social aspect of Git. Okay, let's talk about passwords. So here's why. So I made a joke yesterday about being called to court to defend why I gave you guys bad information or I potentially misled folks. The reason why is because this is really complicated, and Auth0 is nice because you pay them some money, they maintain the stuff, they maintain the training, they maintain all of that. So by doing your own username and password, you're basically saying, no, I can do it better than them, which is absurd. But also, if you just want to do it, then I'll show you how to do it. This will not be on the homework for sure. So, or maybe it should be. I don't know. Anyways, let's talk about it. Okay, so passwords. Everybody knows that the biggest cardinal sin is not to store plain text passwords in the database. Why wouldn't we want to store plain text passwords in the database?
It'll return a different value.
Reasons why we wouldn't want to store plain text passwords in the database. It would return a different value. Like if we didn't store it correctly, then we might not retrieve the same password successfully. What do you mean by that?
Like, you know, when you, I don't know, have a string or something like that, or just like an object type or something like that. Like when you send it through, it might not come out the same result that you needed.
Yeah, so you would have to be very careful about how you're passing the password so that the data type isn't changed along the route. It stays a string from when the browser sends it to when the database stores it. So you have to think about how you're going to store it and what the data type would be. Latonia says not secure. I don't think that's, I need more. I need you folks to convince me that you know why plain text is a bad idea for passwords.
Would it be also like would the problem also be like when you put in plain text, does it like also print out the formatting? Like if you hit enter or whatever, it's gonna give you like dash in or something, or maybe not.
No, not unless you do something weird. But if you are getting to something which is one really good reason. You could be tempted to leak it. You could be tempted to console.log it. You could be tempted to accidentally print it out in logging statements. Let's say you store a password and you throw an error. What if in the error that's thrown, the password shows up in the error message? Could not insert X into table passwords. What if that's shown in plain text? What if we leak it accidentally? Sentry. Notice how I hooked up Sentry to my app so all of my errors would get sent to Sentry so I could look through. If I store passwords in plain text, there's a pretty good chance that one of my error messages on Sentry might contain somebody's password, unless I'm very, very careful. Console log statements, errors. Here's the biggest reason. Somebody gets access to your database, they get access to all the passwords. So if you don't secure your database correctly, and someone is able to get access to it, they now have access to log into every single one of the accounts in your app. That is one of the biggest reasons why. And I could go company by company. Facebook is guilty of storing plain text passwords. They were guilty of it for years. Ubiquiti, the company that makes all the networking gear, they were recently caught this last year storing plain text passwords. It's a thing that keeps popping up in the news. Companies continue to do it, and there's just no good reason for it. There's a lot of tools, and I'll show you one way of not storing passwords in plain text in your database.
Can I share a
There's
quick
a lot of
resource?
response. Yes, please.
Cool. Since we're talking about passwords, I'm going to paste a link in the chat. I found this when I was doing a little research. You can go to this website and you can see a list of companies that have experienced password data breaches, and it is a mighty list. You can read all about what happened. The other neat thing that's at this website is that you can actually enter in a password. So if you go to that website and you click passwords at the top, it'll take you to a search. Okay, Susan says she's used this. That's awesome. And you can actually check to see if your password has been leaked or what passwords have been leaked. Yeah, absolutely. So I just thought that was really neat and a good resource to use in the future. This is why data is important.
Use coupon code Kelly on 1Password to get 50% off.
That's right. With my coupon code, with my affiliate code Kelcor, you can get 50% off at 1Password. Haha, just kidding. Unless.
That's another good one, Brandy. So if let's say that you are passing around a plain text, so this would probably be a good question for your next instructor. But one thing that dangerously set HTML allows is cross-site scripting. And if you're passing a password around, could you use cross-site scripting to read that password out? Yes, probably. But that is Brandy. You should bring that up. Bring that up next week, because I believe things like cross-site scripting will probably be covered next week. In fact, that's a really good one. I haven't even talked about the dangerously set HTML or the where you can just directly render HTML components. That is a dangerous thing to do. But in my mind, there's a lot of reasons, but the biggest one that you should be aware of is if your database is compromised for whatever reason, which means that someone is able to execute SQL on your database and read the contents of your database. They have access to all of your passwords. And if you don't catch it, you'll have someone impersonating a bunch of people's usernames and passwords. And if you store things like credit card data, or addresses or email addresses or things like that, then all of a sudden they have a whole bunch of data that they shouldn't have. And you're gonna have to type out one of those emails saying, we apologize, but our website has been breached and here's the remediation and we've sent everyone to training. And so don't ever do plain text. All right, let's talk about how you would store a password. Is anybody familiar with MD5 or SHA? So let's see a good example of MD5. So what a hash is it's a one-way computation. So you put it's an algorithm where you feed it some data and out the other end comes some gibberish. And from that gibberish, you can't work backwards to figure out what the input was. So let me share my screen. I already am. Okay. So let's say we want to take the word Nathan and we want to create a hash from Nathan. There's a number of different algorithms you can use. MD5 or MD, I think there's a bunch of different versions of it. There's all the SHA hash functions, but what you could do is you could pass it into a hash program like MD5, and it will spit out some gibberish. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to compare things. So we'll be able to tell if if what has been hashed has changed. So let me do that again with Nathan's. So notice that by just adding an extra letter, the hash has completely changed. So hash is just a one-way function that can take an input and produce some gibberish from it. Always the same gibberish should be pointed out. So if I run Nathan through the MD5 hash, you'll notice that it produces the same hash. Okay. Why this is useful to us with passwords is we don't necessarily need to store the password in plain text. We could store a hash. We could store some gibberish of the password. So we aren't actually storing something that a hacker can get in and steal and use to log into accounts. Instead, all we're storing is what looks like gibberish. But in fact, what we can do is we can hash their password when they sign up and save the hash. And then when they log in, we can hash their whatever password they're using to log in with again. We can hash that and we can compare the hashes. So we're not going to be comparing plain text passwords, but instead we're going to be comparing hashes. So anybody have any questions? This would be a good one to have a YouTube video for.
I feel like because this is Latonia, I feel like because it puts out the same each time, there has to be a way for people to work backwards. Maybe not directly a hash, but okay, I can stop talking.
Good point. Let me stop you right there. So let's use the MD5 hash. So MD5 is a hashing function that has been around for a long time. So I'm going to hash the word Nathan. Okay, you can go to a website like, let's see. So a website like CrackStation, and you can give it that hash. And it can decrypt the hash. So MD5 is not considered a secure hashing function. It's really only used for insecure things, like say you wanted to check if two users uploaded the same image. MD5 would be a good choice there because MD5 is pretty fast. You could take an MD5 of one image and the other image, compare the hashes. But MD5 is not considered to be secure, especially for passwords. And there's a whole list of hashing functions that are considered insecure by the cryptography community. And for the folks that are deciding to take on the username password challenge, this is stuff that you have to know. You have to know which hashing function is considered secure and and we'll get into more information that you need to know. So To find out what the most secure hashing function that you should be using for storing passwords is, you should go to the password hashing competition. So passwordhashing.net. So these folks put these different hashing algorithms to the test. Their latest winner was Argon 2. That's a hashing function. That's what I'll show you tonight, is how to hash passwords with Argon 2. There is a whole white paper about how the Argon 2 hashing function works. And I don't know if anybody wants to read through it. It's actually fairly short. It's only 18 pages, but it is very math heavy. And it does have a lot of fancy words that I probably couldn't explain to you. But Argon 2 is the one that we're going to use tonight to hash some passwords. All right. So to do that, I'm going to do a little bit of coding here. I'm going to get rid of all the endpoints that are here, and I'm going to create some new ones. So we're going to make an app.post endpoint. This is going to be for, okay, we're going to do an app.post. This is going to be for signing up. So if you want to manage your own user authentication, then you would want to have some kind of sign up endpoint for users to send you, like a login form, username, password. This is the account I want to create. They hit the create button. It will trigger this endpoint. All right. So the request is probably going to have a body because it's a post. So we'll look inside the request.body. We'll expect the users to send us a username, and we'll expect the users to send us a password when they sign up for an account. All right. Now, what you might be tempted to do, which we just got done talking about. So I'm using the raw PG driver. So we need to make a function called create user, and we're going to store their username and password in the database. So this function is going to take in a username and a password, and it's going to make a query to the database to do a insert into, let's say there's a users table. So let's insert into users, values. Okay, and we'll pass in the username and password. Okay, so we're going to insert a username and a password into our users table. We need to have a table made, so let's go and create some tables. So create table if not exists users. Our users is going to have a schema where the username is the primary key. It's just a string. And then there's a password. And that's some more text. Okay. All right, so down here, once they hit the sign up, we can await. Because we're using await, we need to mark this as an async function. So we need to await the create user function, and we're going to pass it a username, password. Does that look right? We call create user, has a username and password. We shove it into our users table. Let's do send results. Okay, so things are fine. Does that make sense to people? Does that look good? So we got some kind of endpoint that's taking posts. It's got a username and password. Shove it into the database. say okay. Does it look right to people? Guys, we're storing passwords in plain text. This is the one thing we shouldn't do. We're taking whatever the password is and we're shoving it right into, this is a trick question to test all of you.
But aren't you going to add a layer of protection to it?
We do, but but right now all we're doing is we're shoving a password into the database. We have a column called password. That's a no. We don't put plain text passwords in.
So can we put it in an object? Can we also like make our own encryption? Like
Yeah, we're gonna do that.
Okay.
So instead of storing a password, we're gonna store what's called a hash. So we're never, ever going to store the user's password directly. We're going to store a obfuscated, gibberish-looking string that represents their password, but isn't their password. Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and run this just to make sure that my node code is good. Okay, let's ignore this. Let's go to the backend. All right, so we're in my backend folder, all of my stuff. And it's upset because create item table is not defined. We're not just creating the item table anymore. I renamed that function to create tables because we're also creating a user table. Okay, let's run again. There we go. We've got our server running. All right. So we just got done saying we don't want to store passwords directly in the database. We want to store a hash. To do that, we need the Argon hashing function. To get that, let's go and look up Node.js Argon. Here we go. So this is the library we want to use. So to install it, we say npm install Argon 2. So I'll npm install save Argon 2. Okay. So instead of storing the password, we're going to use Argon 2i. There's two different programs that come with Argon. There's an Argon 2i and an Argon 2d. We want to use the 2i. This is more research that you have to do in order to understand what the internals of the Argon program is doing. The two versions are good at different things. The Argon 2i is better at hashing passwords in a memory constrained environment. Okay, so Argon 2i has a function called hash. I believe it has a function called hash. Let me check here. This is what we want. So this library wraps it for you, so you don't have to choose between the D and the I versions. So we're just going to use Argon 2, and by default, it uses I, which is what we want it to use. So we'll say argon2.hash, and the hash takes in what the value is that you want to hash. So in this case, it's going to be our password. So we'll say password, and then argon2 hash takes a salt. So let me write this out really quick and then I'll explain what's going on here. And this is all the options that Argon takes, and we need to pass it as salt. Okay. All right. So when you hash a password, it's possible for hackers to figure out what the underlying value is if you don't add some randomness to what you're hashing. And the randomness that we're adding is what's known as a salt. There's an attack that hackers can use on passwords that you store in the database called a rainbow attack, where massive supercomputers can churn out all of the different hashes for commonly used passwords. So things like password 1234556. So there's these lists that are floating around on the internet. I think crackstation.net even has some. But a rainbow attack is where if you just use the hash and you just hash the password and that's all you do, a rainbow attack is where you use one of these lists that has all of those passwords and all those hashes pre-calculated. A rainbow attack is where you use that list and you use that to figure out what the original password is. There's a wiki page for rainbow attack that does a better job of explaining what I'm trying to explain. But the way that you get around a rainbow attack, a rainbow table attack, is by including what's known as a salt. So when we go and we hash the password, not only are we feeding the password into the hashing algorithm, but we're also feeding it 32 bytes of random gibberish. And what that means is that if a hacker was to do a rainbow attack on this one password, they would only be able to unhash passwords that had the same salt. So when we store passwords, it's incredibly important to use a random bit of data and add that to the password when we're hashing that password. So that is what this salt is doing. It's injecting some randomness. In addition to the password, it's injecting some randomness alongside to prevent attackers from performing a rainbow table attack or just a rainbow attack, one of those two things. All right, so now let's run this. I'll restart my server, or I'll do this. Okay, so the server is running. Let's curl send a post to HTTP localhost 4000. We're going to call the sign up endpoint, and we're going to pass it some data. So we're going to pass it let's just do this on a new line. So we're going to pass it some data. It's going to have a username, which will be Nathan, and a password will be my password. Okay, and that failed because we also need to pass it a header of content type application JSON. See what these errors. Crypto is not defined. Sorry about that. We need to require the const crypto equals require crypto. So the randomness, those 32 bytes we use for the salt, you would use the built-in crypto library that comes with Node.js. Okay. Cannot read property hash if undefined. On line 132. Oh, just getting my imports wrong. Let's retry that. Okay. Oh, yeah. So the database is upset because there's already a user Nathan in it. Let me log into my database and look at that table. So I'm going to the store database and I'm looking at all the tables in here. There's my users table. Let's just drop users table. There we go. Address is already in use. Oh. There we go. All right. So we have just hashed a password and stored a user. I just called this endpoint 4000 sign up with username Nathan, password my password. So if we go and open up, let's just open up another Postgres terminal. Let's go take a look at what that table looks like. So I'm going to my store database, and then I'm going to do a select all from the users table. So here's what this table looks like. I'll blow this up a little bit. So we have two columns in our table. We have a username and a hash. This is the hash. So notice that you don't see the word my password in there anywhere. So when we made our curl to the back end and we were saving this my password, notice that you don't see my password anywhere in here. It's just gibberish. So if you plan on storing passwords in the database, make sure you do a hash in order to store it. And this string right here has a bunch of different parts in it, but it all boils down to how this hash was computed. So the first part of this says that the hash was computed with the Argon 2 program. These are the parameters that are fed into it. So V means something, M means memory usage, T means time cost. There's a whole bunch of parameters that go into this algorithm, Argon 2. But then there's two other pieces here. This is the salt that was used for the password, and then this is the hashed version of the password. All this is the, yep.
I was just curious if you knew that that was that part because it was in front of the $, but they're all marked by the $.
Yep, the $sign means every piece is a chunk. So the $sign is the delimiter between all the different parts. Okay.
So I just had a question.
Jill, are you trying to make a joke, or are you trying to catch me up in a joke again?
I just had a quick question about, so if it wasn't a computer trying to hack a series of passwords and it was just one individual, they would know how to break this apart for the hash part that is just the password to put it into one of those databases of hash passwords.
So this right here,
yes,
this end part, that is not the password. That's a hash of the password. So if someone gets a hold of that, they still don't have access to the password because they don't know how it was computed.
Okay, I thought you said that there were databases of hashed versions of common passwords.
They are, and that's what this extra layer here prevents.
Okay.
So we're feeding in some randomness that is only known to us in this database.
Okay, so it's not just adding extra gobbledygook, it's actually re-scrambling the password again.
Exactly. Okay. It is. It's an extra layer on top of it that's re-scrambling it. And because it's random, that means that anybody that has generated a massive list of all these pre-computed hashes, it means that all those hashes don't work because those hashes will not have this extra layer that we're adding on, this extra salt that we're introducing.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. That helped to, hopefully that helps some folks.
And that crypto program, is that adding a different salt for each user? Or is it the same? If it's the same one for everybody, we can just do it ourselves. But if it generates it once and then we're just storing that, then I guess it wouldn't need to generate it again and have it match or anything.
So by default, this won't. I don't think. By default, this will provide you with the salt. I may be wrong. you need to pass in a salt. If you don't pass in a salt, I don't think it's salted. I might be wrong, but I'll tell you that if
But the
you're
crypto
hashing,
program is creating the salt, right?
it's taking in the salt and it's using it for that extra layer of hashing. So notice how
salt
here,
is input by us, and it's literally taking the word salt and.
yep,
Okay.
it's
Thank you.
a property going into this function. So we are generating the 32 random bytes. We are generating the salt and passing it in. If we wanted, we could save this salt into the database and use it for every user. But that would introduce more insecurity, because if someone were to compute one set of, if someone were to find one user's password, they could then turn around and use that for every other password. So
Right,
by
but you
adding
could
that
take
extra
some of
layer
their
on top,
data and make that the salt, like, I don't know, security questions or something like that, or the date they opened their account or something that would be different for everybody.
right? Yeah, you could let the user choose a salt. I don't know if there's necessarily any advantage to allowing the user, like an attribute of the user, like their email or their username. In fact, I would almost think of that as more of an insecurity, because if there is some meaning behind it, then that's something that could be exploited. That would give someone a clue into how to crack that hash. This right here, where we're using whatever the hardware provides us for an RNG, a random number generator, if we're using the hardware and just allowing the hardware to generate 32 bytes of random data, this is about as good as it gets. I think if you take your crypto really seriously, then you would start exploring things like entropy. How does the RNG number generator get, how does that pool get filled? How random are the numbers that are being generated for salt? So you could definitely go off the deep end here.
So it
But
is
I want to point out
something random. I thought you just told me that it was taking the word salt and encrypting it.
Oh, no. Sorry. Salt is just a box being fed into the parameter salt. The randomness is coming from here. This
Yeah, okay.
crypto.random bytes. Yep.
That's what I was asking. And it's going to do a different random thing for each user.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly. Now here's where things get a little tricky, because well, okay, let's keep going before I throw a wrench in this. Okay. So we've got the sign up. So we have folks registering. Yeah, exactly, Shaw. And exactly, Jahio. The salt adds an extra layer of encryption to it. It makes it harder for folks to unhash your password. So we've got a sign up. Let's go ahead and write a login. So we've got app.post. Let's have users, after they've signed up, they can now log in. And they'll send the same kind of data. So they'll give us their username and password. And all we're going to do is create some bool called logged in. And it'll start off as being false. And then we'll do some stuff, and then we'll send logged in, and we'll return whether that's true or false, whether they logged in successfully. Okay, to validate a user's password, we need to do, well, first we need to go and look up the hash in the database. Because the function we're about to write, Argon 2, has a verify function that takes in a hash and a password, and it will compare the password by means of running it through the hash again, and it will compare it with whatever hash that you currently have saved for that user. So we need to go into the database, and we need to go and look up user's hash that is given a username. So let's write a function here called const get hash by username. This function is going to take in a username. And what we'll do is we'll do a const users equals wait db.query. It's going to take in a username. Okay, so we'll select hash from the users table where the username equals username, and we'll limit it to 1 for good measure. Okay, if users dot, is row count a thing? So if we don't get any results coming back from the database, we're going to return null. Otherwise, we're going to return users dot rows at position 1, because we should, if we have some rows, it should be safe to just return one of them. I think this will work. Let's double check it. So let's go in here, and before we do that, let's await and pass in the username. Let's just console log, see if we get a valid hash. Restart my server. We're going to send the same kind of data, but now we're calling the login endpoint, and it's printing out undefined. So I got my database. Got my database wrong. All right. So we're running a DB query, select hash from the users table, where username equals, and then $1 just means whatever variable is being passed in. Maybe it's my logic there. Let me get rid of that. Do this again. No, it's still undefined. Do we have a user in there? It's called, yeah, there's a user. His name is Nathan. Let's back up. Let's do a console.log here. Just make sure we're getting our username sent into the post body correctly. So I should see a, there it is. Okay, so Nathan is getting sent in here. Nathan is inside the box called username. Okay. Well, let's take this and let's just run it in Postgres and see what happens. Where username equals Nathan. Cool. So that's returning something. So my SQL looks right. So I'm going to go cheat and see if I could find another program that does something similar. Nope, I can't cheat. I haven't written this code before. All right. How about we do this? Let's console log what's coming back from the database. So we're calling login. There we go. So we've got some stuff coming from, there it is. So it has rows. So return, oh, I found it. Does anybody else see the issue here? It should be rows at 0. All of our indexes for our arrays start at 0. I don't know why I put a 1 in there. There we go. All right. Now we can stop, rerun. There we go. So now we're getting some object that contains the hash. So what we can do over here, or rather what we should do up here, is return .hash. So now this function properly returns whatever the hash is that's we've stored in our database for that user. Okay, so now we've got a hash. We could say const hash equals. So this is the user's hash for their password. Argon 2 verify takes 2 arguments. The first one it takes is the The first one that it takes is the hash that you have, the thing that you store in your database. And then the other thing that it takes is the password that's being passed in. So behind the scenes, Argon is going to hash that password, and then it's going to compare the two of them. For some reason, this verify requires bytes to be passed in for the password. So we're going to coerce our string into a series of bytes. But after that is done, Argon 2 verify returns a promise. So we need to capture that into a variable. So Argon 2 verify is going to return a promise, and the value of that promise is going to be either true or false, whether that hash matched, whether the password that the user gave us was matches that hash. So we don't really need a logged in box. We just need this is valid. Yes or no? Does the hash match? Okay. So restart the server. Okay, let me make this bigger so we can all see this. This is my server window. Okay, so I just called the login endpoint with the password that I signed up with, and it's returning logged in is true because Argon 2 verify returned true. If I were to change my password to my password just to something else, now we get logged in false because the hash doesn't match. Argon2.verify is returning false. All right. I've got two thoughts to share with you now that we've done all this. Even this isn't secure. So let's go into hash. You'll notice that hash comes with a ton of options. By default, the options that this uses are not what the authors consider to be secure. So if we go and dig into the actual JavaScript so let's go and look at hash. These are the TypeScript definitions. We want the actual code. All right. So these defaults, the hash length, the salt length, the time cost, the memory cost, these are all different tuning parameters that Argon will take. And the authors themselves say that this isn't as secure as it should be for storing passwords. They require that you use, or they recommend that you use a salt of at least 128 bytes. So unless you do your research, even if you do what I have just shown you here and just use Argon hash, passive assault, you're still not doing what the authors consider to be secure enough. Why they didn't just set the defaults to what they thought secure enough was, I have no idea. Maybe it was just to just for this moment right now, where I can say to you all that this is a scary thing to do. So if you truly want to use this, if you really want to manage your own username and passwords, by all means, do so. But make sure you do a bit of research on your own and take a look at these different tuning parameters, because each of these tuning parameters will change what the hash is. So you better know what you want to use for your tuning parameters and stick with them. Otherwise, you will run into issues. So if you decide you want to use a salt length of 128 bytes, but you've collected 10,000 passwords in your database, and you all of a sudden decide to change the tuning parameters, all of the hashes from that point forward will be different, which will put you in this fun world of trying to test different anyways. All right. So that's the first part. You need to know how Argon 2 works pretty well inside and out. And that's a lot more work than just doing Auth0. The other thing is that, okay, so we've logged in. What now? Are you going to keep sending your username and password for every request you make? Like, compare and contrast with what we did today with Auth0, where you had an access token, you created an authorization header, you just passed the access token in there, And that was it. The way this is set up right now, you will need to pass in username and password every single time, which is a problem because.
Do you think we can get like the token from signing up from the username and password and reason that?
So that's an option. You could use the hash like a token. I don't think that's a good idea. There's a whole world that we haven't touched on called session management, where Auth0 takes care of this for you because that access token expires after a certain time. You can think of that as a session. When you log in, you get an access token. It's around for a period of time. That's your session. That's your that represents the time that you're spending with the website. We need a concept of a session because continually sending the username and password for every request is a really bad idea. Sending the hash isn't a terrible, it's better than sending the username and password every time. But an even better idea would be to do something along the lines of, once they've logged in, generate some random bytes. And I mean random, like really random. So something similar to this line where we generate these 32 random bytes. When they log in, generate some random bytes and link them to that user and use those random bytes as their quote unquote token. That starts to get into the world of session management, which is I'm not sure, maybe next week you'll hear more about that, but session management is also really, really difficult. And we haven't even talked about that. I will leave you with one last thing. There is a library called Express Session that is built just for people that want to run their own username and passwords. And it will do some of what I'm describing for you. So you shouldn't build session management from scratch. That would also be a bad idea. If you really want to go down this rabbit hole, I've shown you enough to shoot yourself in the foot. And we are at time. Any questions? I'm sorry that I've just been talking at you for what feels like almost an hour, but I just wanted to, if you really want to do username and password, you now have a YouTube recording and there it is. Questions?
Yeah, I want to say that's helpful, like for the future. Well, I think most of our capstones have some sort of like, I guess, use. I mean, like some sort of like concept of probably using some users.
And I will go toe to toe with anybody that wants to argue with me. If you really think that you need to store username and passwords, I will show you that you don't. And I will, heck, if it even comes to it, I'll write the code for you just to keep you from having to do password management. I've worked at 4 companies, and the current one that I'm at, they did username and password. And guess what I've been doing the last 2 weeks? I've been replacing with Auth0 because they asked me when I joined, hey, are we doing username and password management correctly? And I said, no, you aren't. Let's use something else so I don't have to be responsible for this. So I'm doing that for my current company. Of the other 3, every single one of them have avoided username and password management because they take their security seriously. I've never seen a use case. If you're just running something that maybe people are going to host themselves, or it's not super critical or sensitive, but you still want username and passwords, then yeah, maybe this would be a good way to go. But go ahead, Jahil. Did you have more? I'm happy to show this stuff just for your own education, but like if it comes to actually applying it, like I would strongly consider doing otherwise.
Oh, what I was trying to say was like, I think for the most part, at some point, if we're going to still continue to develop our capstones, we may have a functionality where we may require people to be signed in. So I think it's useful, like regardless, like what you're showing us. Yeah, like it's all helpful at the end of the day. We may not get it now, but if we ever want to go back and update our capstones and stuff, and we probably keep on doing this, like we'll understand what it is and look back and use this as help or reference or guide. So I think this is a really good thing. Yeah.
Good. I'm glad. And in all honesty, I wouldn't expect when you guys get on the job, I wouldn't expect you to come back and watch this YouTube video. I'd much rather you guys dive right into the documentation and try it yourself, because a lot of this stuff, you can have someone saying it to you, but until you try it out yourself, it won't necessarily stick. So Brielle, for office hours, are folks good with Sunday again? Same time on Sunday? That worked well for me.
Is it 12 or 1? 12 or 1?
I don't know. You picked last time, so why don't you?
Oh, it's fine. No, I was wondering because I
11?
got 11. Okay, that's good. I'll do that. I was confused last time. I don't think I checked it on Slack. Anyways.
Okay. And then just for a reminder, tomorrow we're going to do all group work. So, I mean, nothing is off limits. If we want to talk about databases, we want to talk about Node.js, we want to talk about React, we want to talk about authentication, deployments, Jest, Cypress, all those things nothing is off limits tomorrow. So make sure you bring some stuff to talk about and have something for me to work on. I had such a blast last time. I can't wait to do it again. So for the homework, I would like folks to try again with what we covered today. I would really like folks to try adding an endpoint on their back end that requires an access token. So that check jot middleware that we went through in class today. You don't need to do anything with the permissions unless you want to. That's just a bonus. But I would really like folks to try setting up the API in Auth0 and requiring an access token to be passed to an endpoint on the back end. Again, there's no pressure here. If you think that this is an endpoint that really doesn't deserve or require an access token, just do it for the homework. Just do it to show me you know what's going on. And then after we get done with the homework, you're more than welcome to rip it out. Right, yeah. My code, I definitely went pretty fast today, so I'll get all of that pushed up. I'll get the Google Classroom assignment made. It's still only due on Sunday at midnight, so you have plenty of time. And especially tomorrow, if folks get started on it and have questions, I would love to answer some of those tomorrow as well too. I'm hoping that this makes sense to folks to do this within their capstone as opposed to me coming up with a contrived example. But if you really want me to set up a Create React app for you, I can. But it sounds like most folks know how to set up a Create React app if they're not using React right now. So I'll push up the code. I'll make sure those links are included in the homework, everything that I did today. And I talked through a lot of stuff, but the slides also have info on how to set up, especially on Auth0, how to set up those. Okay, I'm done talking. Thank you guys for coming tonight, and I will see you all tomorrow. All right, have a great rest of your evening.